Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host this week, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad right now to welcome to the program Gene Bruskin, who's a 50-year activist in labor, cultural, and international solidarity activities. He's worked for a range of local and national unions and actively participated in and led a variety of international worker solidarity projects, including co-founding U.S. labor against the war during the Iraq War, and the National Labor Network for a Ceasefire since the outbreak of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. Jean is also a playwright and has written 3 musicals with social justice themes, the most recent being The Return of John Brown. John Brown, my brother from another mother. Jean, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Eleanor.
Absolutely. We're very glad to have you. And for those listening, we're recording this on Tuesday, March 18th. And of course, over the course of the night, Israel restarted its genocide in Gaza. And so it seems an apt time to have this conversation, connecting the dots. And so, Gene, I wanted to start with doing just that. And of course, you have a history of connecting these dots going back to, more than 20 years. And so I wanted to ask you if you could just talk a little bit about the connection between what we saw happen in Iraq, Afghanistan, what we see happening now in Gaza. A question that I get a lot of times if I'm organizing with folks who aren't already part of the anti-war movement is like, well, what does that have to do with me and my ability to feed my kids, or my, very low wages, or my not being able to make rent? So help us out, Gene. Answer that question.
Yeah, no, that's the right question. And I think we can see really today that it really couldn't be clearer in a way that that war and foreign policy are completely bound up with our domestic policy, immigration, workers' lives, union lives, and in some ways, in addition to the 2 wars that are going on in Israel against the Palestinians and in Ukraine, or the 2 most prominent wars. There's a bunch of them, other wars going on. We have a massive migration all over the globe, and that migration is completely connected to the whole historic imperial and colonial foreign policies of the U.S. and Europe. And so we have the huge issue to deal with the implications of what has driven millions of workers from their countries in order to survive. And when you look at that, you find out that what a friend of mine likes to say, I'm not sure where it originally came from, which is they are here because we were there. But partly because a lot of our wars and all this foreign policy impositions haven't taken place in the United States. We had the Civil War. It's always on somebody's territory. So in the middle of this, the other thing for us to understand is how important it is what we do in support of the people who our own government is attacking, the importance of that to those people, because we are in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm familiar with that quote where they're here because we're over there. And I'm also curious if you can talk a little bit about the we've had on the program before Christian Sorensen, who has a Substack called Mapping the Business of War, and he maps, for instance, the immense amount of money that's put into the military and industrial complex. And he talks a little bit about this idea of a just transition and, for instance, like what those people could be doing, in research and development and what have you, as opposed to, creating death machines to oppress people across the globe. And of course, also here at home via things like the 1033 program and whatnot. But I'm curious if you could also talk a little bit about how our push as workers for safer workplaces, healthier workplaces, workplaces that actually go towards the good of our own communities, how that is also inextricably tied to the massive war machine that the U.S. empire has.
Yeah. I just saw a figure. There's a website, Cost of War, costofwar.org or something, that by one estimate, uh, in since 9/11, the United States has spent $8 trillion on both the wars, and that includes the money on Homeland Security. That includes the money for the incredible cost to deal with the veterans whose lives and bodies are sort of destroyed, sending on these missions to kill, and then they themselves emotionally or physically destroyed. That alone, if you try to imagine if in these last 25 years, we took that $8 trillion and said, what do we need here? Well, I've had the good luck to be in Europe a few times over the years. And one thing that really struck me, and they have huge problems, but I remember this talk with this one cab driver in the Basque area, and he said, "Well, I sort of like my taxes. I don't like, I'd like to have the money." He says, "I like the fact that I wake up every morning. If I don't have to worry about it, something would happen if I lost my job, I'd be taken care of. If my wife is pregnant, I don't have to worry about it because she gets a leave. Uh, and of course, I get my health care is free, and my son is in the university. I never had to worry about whether I could afford that because that's covered. Now I pay a lot of taxes, but on the other hand, I wake up every morning and I don't have to worry about that." And it struck me uh, that in the United States, almost everybody, except maybe the top 10%, have to worry about all of those things, and we don't even notice that it's so chronic, we don't realize that it doesn't have to be that way. And it's not like Europe is are socialist revolutionary economies, they're sort of social democratic and having lots of troubles right now. But that's built into their system, whereas our system, not only isn't it built in, but under the current government, what little things we have, they're trying to eliminate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my mother's Swedish and didn't move to the States until the 80s, and she likes to tell the story of how her dad was like, 90% tax bracket or something, and he was very happy with it. He was a well-paid engineer, and he was happy to give his taxes to what at the time went to the well-being of Swedish society. Now, I could spend 4 hours talking about how horrible Sweden's doing now, not least of all desperately trying to be the sycophant of U.S. empire, but that's a different story altogether.
Yeah.
And I wanted to I wanted to talk about this too because this is something that we talked about off air, and folks who know me know that I don't like to say depressive realist, just honest, and I recognize that we can't address a problem unless we accept that we have one. It's kind of like alcoholism. Um, and when we were talking, and you said, "Well, I've got nothing to tell you in terms of like legitimate policy or even really like a legitimate movement that speaks to how we can create this just transition, like how to get coal miners working at solar plants, or how to get folks in the military industrial complex and R&D working to address like climate change or something like that." And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about this and talk about like how we have these beautiful ideas. To quote the turn of the century French anarchists, we have these beautiful ideas, but what does that mean in terms of actualizing those ideas?
Yeah. I mean that's a big challenge of our age. I think that the particularly since World War II, our industry, as Eisenhower described it, the military-industrial complex, U.S. industry has sort of been, in so many ways, built around defense and war. Um, Obviously, not all of it. I mean, we produce automobiles and so on, but it and now as sort of the end of any illusion, there was an illusion coming out of World War II because we had basically destroyed Europe and Japan, that there was going to be unlimited prosperity. And in the 50s, when all our major companies like General Electric and General Motors were making unlimited profits, there was extensive unionization. Actually, a third of the private sector were in unions, and there was enough money for people to have pensions, for people to have regular raises. Now, a lot of people, including people of color, weren't necessarily in the unions in the right majorities, but that was sort of a ceiling that was very common. By the 70s, that started changing. And by now, we're now in a situation where there's still enough for everybody, but the inequality is now really at a historic level. And so this economy, as we've constructed it, this polluting, militarized economy has created this massive inequality, and is also destroying the globe either through war or through climate. And so we're in this crisis. And the problem that we're seeing with the rise of Donald Trump is that the Democrats who, for those of us who were hoping for some kind of light and intelligence, are completely incapable of taking on these problems. And in fact, it's the blatant hypocrisy of the Democrats that support actually the same things that Donald Trump supports, but pretend that they don't. And so the American public has been sort of duped into thinking that we're doing the right thing. But so that morally we were told that we're supporting Israel against the Palestinians for some bizarre idea that this was supporting these attacks on Jews, and that we were helping Ukraine against the evil of Russia. When Trump gets in, he starts immediately talking to Ukraine about how we want their assets and how we're going to divide them up. And he starts talking about Gaza as real estate. In fact, if you look at the actual outcome and motives behind U.S. foreign policy, ever since the Monroe Doctrine, it has been basically to grab the minerals and other benefits of all the countries of the world where we're interested in it. So we're in this kind of crisis, and I think this is the moment where there's no way for us to get through this without speaking truth, And so Trump has exposed these true motives, and we have to educate workers. We have to educate our communities. We have to explain to people, for example, how our foreign policies have resulted in people from Haiti and Venezuela and Nicaragua and Mexico, all the countries where we've destroyed lots of their ability to function, why they're here, and so I feel like in a way, by what Trump is doing and by attacking so many aspects of our society, he's laid the groundwork for the resistance. We all need each other, and we need to actually be thinking about the global stage, because that's where Trump acts on, that's where the United States has acted on. We have to see this kind of global solidarity abroad and at home, and we have to educate each other. And the labor movement certainly has to do that work.
Yeah, and I'm curious too about that because it seems like, with your work and some of the work that I've seen others do, like RWU and things like that, UAW, unions are doing this work. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the importance of unionization and pushing towards unionization and how that's linked to building that kind of international solidarity that you just talked about.
Yeah, thank you. I think um, one of the good things that's happened um, in the last 10 years is the attitude toward unions has changed dramatically. Every poll that anybody takes, most people feel like unions are a good thing, and it didn't used to be that way. And I credit the Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy movement, Bernie, the women's movement, all these movements that we've seen uh, have sort of set the stage for that. But the in a capitalist society that we live in, unless you have some power over what Marx called the means of production, which is the sector of where the wealth is created, where the Elon Musks of the world are, unless you have some power over that, demonstrations are good, and I'm in favor of them. I've been to a few, uh, and uh, uh, and disruptions of different kinds are good. But unless you're impacting the actual functioning of the economy, you're not really exerting power. So we saw a sign of that more recently with Sean Fain and the auto workers, where for years the auto UAW and the big three have sort of acted on the assumption that we sort of what's good for you is good for me, and if you're prospering, I'm prospering, and that's a complete fallacy that the labor movement has lived by in many ways. Sean Fain said, "No, what's good for us is not necessarily good for you. As a matter of fact, every time we make a deal, it gets worse for us. We have about a third of the members we used to have. And not only that, I'm not even going to shake your hands to start negotiation because I'm not feeling that good about the way we've been treated. And not only that, but I'm not gonna play by the whole form of negotiations, just like the Democrats shouldn't be doing in Congress, where there's ways you're supposed to conduct yourself. So instead of doing what they traditionally do, he said, as a matter of fact, to get things going, I'm going to shut these plants, just so you see. And if you don't come to a deal next week, I'm going to shut another group, but I'm not telling you which. And little by little, he tightened the screws, and he got the best contract that they've gotten in history. Uh, and then he declared, and people are continually talking about this, that all the unions in the country need to line their contracts up to expire in May 1st, 2028, so that when that date hits, not only will the UAW be striking, but the teachers will be striking, and the Amazon workers will be striking, and the nurses will be striking. And we'll strike not just to improve our own contracts, but over the broad kind of social demands, for the things we really need, like health care for all, for example. And that then they cannot but listen to us. I think that's the kind of vision we need. And that's the way we sort of transform the whole idea of changing the economy for the productive needs, for the social needs and not the military needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk about that a lot. Like our power isn't in our ability to buy things, and things like that. Our power literally exists in our ability to either work or to withhold that labor. And the whole like the what's good for you is good for me. That really only applies when we're talking about other people. Like what's good for the people of Gaza, it would be good for us. And what's good if we were to have access to things like livable wages and healthcare and education, Well, that would also be good for the rest of the world because it would signify a significant shift in priorities, as in investing in people as opposed to war and death and destruction. And with that, I wanted to ask your opinion on this. RWU a week ago um, uh, passed a resolution that condemned the use of the national rail and transport system to transport weapons that are used in internationally recognized genocide.
Mhm.
So they basically said that it was a resolution that sought to end the use of the national rail system to transport military cargo that's used in genocide. I was wondering to hear your thoughts about that, and also if this is something that translates to an actual like embargo, like we've seen in Sweden recently. Just the dock workers just stopped a shipment that we've seen in Spain and things like that. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that, that was sort of like a signal, uh, and it's the right signal. And there's a lot of other folks sort of working in that direction. Say there's a campaign against Maersk, which is a name that a lot of people don't know, but Maersk actually controls a massive amount of international shipping of cargoes of every kind, including a key role in stuff that military stuff and stuff that goes to Israel. Uh, but the railroad RWU, the Railroad Workers United, is a relatively small network. They're a network of the unions that should be a large network, namely all the various parts of the railroad workers unionized movement. But the railroad workers are fragmented into a whole series of unions. And I worked actually with the railroad workers, BMWE, the people who lay the track all over the country. I worked with them for about 5 years, helping them build a membership mobilization uh, network, and got to sort of see up close that these unions aren't thinking big, but it's not has nothing to do with whether the workers are thinking big. So, for example, in the course of negotiations, where the company was taking away um, their and minimizing the health care that railroad workers get, which is a disgrace because of the dangers they face. Uh, with the rank and file support and the support of the president, they came out for Medicare for all, basically saying, look, like we can keep arguing every contract with the railroad industry about whether they're going to kick up our 1% on our healthcare, take away something. That's a useless fight. That shouldn't even be on the bargaining table. Healthcare should be a right. So I think that kind of work, where in some of the other uh, industries, like in shipping, where the ILWU and the ILA, which handle most of the stuff that comes in and out of our ports, particularly ILWU historically has done some really tremendous stuff of shutting down ports for apartheid and even for stuff around Israel, Gaza. Uh, on the other hand, they have incredible healthcare and contracts. But what we need, if you can imagine, the ILWU and the ILA basically control the two ports. The railroad industry, which is largely unionized, and the Teamsters that are largely unionized right now, including, say, Amazon workers. If in 2028 these unions got together and said enough is enough, Sean Fain is right. May 1st, 2028, we're putting down our tools. Nothing, nothing would move. Nothing would move. And President Trump, or whatever he'd be at the time, couldn't even go to the airport. Nobody could visit him in Mar-a-Lago. Uh, Elon Musk, wouldn't be able to even get his electricity. In Sweden, where this happened before Musk came in with Trump. In Sweden, Musk has a plant and an office building, and he refused to accept the union. Well, in Sweden, I think they've got 80% plus in unions. So first, one by one, they first the workers went on strike. Then they refused to deliver anything to any of the offices where Elon Musk works. And then the dock workers refused to handle any cargo that came into the country that had anything to do with Elon Musk, you know. Now, Sweden is not the major profit center from us, but it just gives you a sense of what the power is. And we are not taught to understand that kind of power. We're more or less taught to look out for yourself. And every experience that I've been in with workers and strikes that I've been a part of and organizing campaigns, when people feel that collective action, when people feel that spirit, they feel their power, you know. I think a recent example was Jewish Voice for Peace put in a couple hundred people in the lobby of the Trump building, you know, and occupied that for most of the day. And you look at the faces and the feelings of all those people in there. Those experiences are sort of transformational. And we need to make sure that not everybody gets a chance to have those experiences, and that also we organize a structure in this period that allows that stuff to sort of grow and prosper strategically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I there's a page on Instagram that I follow called Vent Diagrams, which I
Mm.
always love a pun. And they have a lot of things that talk about, you know, our particular times in this final season of America. And one of them that I saw that I really liked was it's very scary to resist and to fight back right now. It's also incredibly important. So, and I think we can hold both of those things. And that's not just with regards to foreign wars, but of course here at home. There was a protest recently inside of Congress where folks that were part of Free DC and the movement for DC statehood were locking arms with people that were protesting the genocide in Gaza. So making these connections really obvious and really clear in these protests that, like you said, can be very transformational for folks who have never met with their own power before because we're not programmed to recognize that. And so you've mentioned, we only have like a couple of minutes left, but you've mentioned May 1st, 2028 a couple of times, which is more than 3 years away. And so I'm curious, what would you say we need to be doing right now, uh, either, you know, in preparation of this, or what can we do right now to address the issues that we are dealing with daily, and that, of course, the people across the globe are dealing with daily because of U.S. empire?
Well, the one thing that's happening actually as of next week, the 17th or 18th, is CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, which has been a model for trade unionism in the whole country as a democratic, worker-led, multiracial, militant organization that fights for not only the rights of teachers, but rights of the community. They are convening a national meeting of unions and progressive community organizations from all over the country to plan for May 1st of this year. Because while all these communities in their own ways have been protesting and demonstrating, federal workers, people fighting on environmental stuff, Jewish Voice for Peace, and so on. We need to bring these movements together and have people see each other. So the first real goal for that, to bring these many demonstrations, is to May Day, May 1st, 2025. Most people don't realize that May Day is an American holiday. It actually initially came after something when they called the Haymarket Massacre, where in 1885 or 6, workers were arrested and killed at a demonstration in Chicago, a workers' demonstration. And the following year, workers all over the world called protests in solidarity with the U.S. workers who were fighting, among other things, for the 8-hour day. That became established as May Day, and it was an international holiday from the first. Eventually, by the 1890s and later, they invented Labor Day, which was a day to have a barbecue. And because Labor Day, May Day had in many parts of the world very radical unions as support of it, even though it was our holiday, we walked away from it until recently, and it's being recovered now, and this year will be again.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, interestingly enough, just a little extra snippet about May Day. So everywhere else in the world, May Day is pretty much like celebrated, except for here. And in fact, in 1958, Eisenhower declared May 1st Law Day. And so if you Google Law Day, it says it's meant to reflect on the role of law in the foundation of the country and to recognize its importance for society. I mean, I feel like if I sent this to a Hollywood producer, they'd be like, that's a little too on the nose. Literally, like, it's not just about beating our own history out of us, sometimes literally, but also replacing it with this sort of jingoist, whitewashed respect for authority that obviously it's not good for us. It's good for them. And so that's another little snippet there. Gene, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and connecting these really important dots, especially on a day like today. Where is there a good place for folks to follow the work that you do, or would you point them in the direction of any place to follow this issue of connecting these dots in terms of labor and war?
Um, I don't know sort of the best sort of single place for that. I know for the labor's work around Gaza, it's the labor for ceasefire.org. And for me personally, people can just send me an email at genebruskin@gmail.com. And I'll just say that one of my work, which we won't have time to talk about, but since I retired, I've written 3 musicals about workers and about social justice. And I believe that that a key way to build our movement is to build our culture. We can't win without a people's culture.
Amen. And I want to be in one of those musicals someday, Gene. I'm just saying that y'all heard it here first. I'm putting this on air.
Okay. All right. You're signed up already.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Gene. Really appreciate it.
All right. Great talking with you. Take care.